I went to China as much to travel with Bill Porter as to see China. Under the name Red Pine, Bill had spent 20 years studying Chinese, studying Buddhism and Daoism, and translating poems by the old Tang and Sung dynasty monks. I was especially interested in the hermits that Bill had written about in his book Road to Heaven, the ones he and his friend Steve Johnson had photographed, Buddhists and Daoists, who lived the ascetic life, who isolated themselves far back in the mountains of China and practiced their religion. Bill had traveled into the mountains 4 times in the writing of his book. This time he wanted to return to visit these remarkable people again. We stayed a couple days in Hong Kong and a few more days in Beijing. But in our hearts, we were already 1,000 miles west of Beijing, in the mountains near Shian. At one time, hundreds of years ago, Shian was known as Jiang'an, and it was the capital of all China, as well as being the eastern end of the famous Silk Road. For us now, though, it was the gateway to the Jungnan Mountains. Those mountains, sacred to the Chinese, held the hermits. While arranging for our trips into the mountains, nothing went easy in China. We explored this ancient city. Bill introduced me to the special Shian soup called ma shi soup, one of his favorite memories of the city. I loved it, and I asked him what was in it.
Ma shi is the name for that particular bean soup. Well, that features beans, but it has many things in it. So ma shi just means a bunch of different stuff.
I back with him. The emperor agreed to let him build a temple to keep these priceless scriptures in. And this temple became known as Kayenta, or Big Goose Pagoda. It got that name because the people who passed the imperial exams signed their names near the archways of the pagoda, and the look of these names had the appearance of columns of migrating geese. Bill also took me to visit the Forest of Steles, a garden filled with Buddhist and Daoist statues and carvings. He was teaching me about the hermit tradition. The museum near the garden featured a statue of Lao Tzu, Taoism's founder, as well as the famous horse, which, Bill explained, represented Daoist thought. We were very fortunate to be able to watch an artist do a rubbing of one of the most famous of the steles, that of Bodhidharma, the hermit monk who brought Zen Buddhism to China, and whose mountainside cave we would visit later in our trip. Soon we were on our way to the mountains, to the hermits. Our first stop was the Xingji Temple, a Pure Land Buddhist temple, which housed a famous 100-foot-high pagoda built to house the remains of Shan Dao, a 7th century Buddhist master who helped spread this particular sect of Buddhism throughout China. We met with Sudong, the abbot of this temple, whom Bill had met before. Sudong received us graciously, and his disciple prepared tea for us. It was the kind of hospitality we were to receive so often on our trip. Bill and Sudong talked for 15 or 20 minutes, mostly discussing the importance of a hermit life. Then we left the temple, pausing to enjoy the landscape before we drove off. An hour later, we were at the entrance to the Feng River Gorge, and we began our hike up the mountainside to an old temple known as the Jingye Temple. We were greeted with a sign over the temple's door, which, Bill explained, translated as, "Use the Dharma to protect the Dharma." He remembered this temple and its abbot very well. The old monk had told Bill that he believed monks and nuns are the freest people in China.
Well, this is the temple founded by Daoist, who himself founded the precept school, the Lizong sect of Chinese Buddhism, one of the major sects of Chinese Buddhism, and emphasizing monastic discipline as the foundation for enlightenment. And he lived in the 7th century, and this is a temple that developed from out of the hut that he lived in.
This temple was in pretty bad shape, but a young monk from Mongolia welcomed us to join him for an evening meal of noodles and to stay for a good night's sleep. He then took us up the trails behind the temple, where we could clearly see the gorge and the spectacular mountains surrounding it.
We're about 100 meters above the Jingye Temple, and we've off to the left. This is the throne, or the seat where Dao Xuan used to sit in meditation when he was practicing. And in the distance, of course, the ridges of the Zhongnan Mountains, and our guide, who lives here. When he was here, Dao Xuan never slept and didn't eat for 3 months.
你看那边那个山很像一个睡佛，像不像？对吗？最前面这个。
Yeah, that's a Sleeping Buddha mountain.
Which one?
Oh, right over here. The one that, any of the ones, but that's sort of like a Sleeping Buddha.
Uh-huh. Early the next morning, after a breakfast of rice, apples, and tea, Bill and I went back down the mountain and crossed the Feng River to reach the simple hut of Juanfu, a nun whom Bill had visited before. She had told Bill about living in the mountains, that such a life is very hard, that you can't live there if you're still attached, if you haven't seen through the red dust, the illusions of this world. She too welcomed us, preparing tea and walnuts for us as we sat with her in front of her hut. Her hut was simple, filled with those utensils and instruments which a person would need in order to survive alone in the mountains. Bill talked with her about her Buddhist practice. He also asked about other hermits living in the mountains, and she gave us directions to the hut of a monk whom Bill hadn't visited before, who lived another 2 or 3 miles up the valley behind her. I was impressed with what I thought was a very comfortable conversation Bill had with her, so I asked him about it.
Often, due to the heavy dialect of many of these northern monks, I could only often guess at what they were saying. It's a good thing she drew us a map. I don't think I would have been able to understand her directions.
这个就金刚法师呢？金刚法师都在上帝在转接入都来光法在一起。哦。他们这几个修行人都在一起住的。是不是那个西观音寺？不是观音寺。不是西观音寺。没钱的。哦。还是车会那个地方。哦，还是车会附近。哦。反正我们先走。
After following a couple of false trails, we located the hut of the monk she was referring to. He was out gathering wood when we arrived, but an old nun and a young disciple were there, and they immediately prepared us a bowl of noodles and some tea. The experience made Bill think of a classic moment in the poetry of the hermit monks, this one by Jia Dao, called Seeking but Not Finding the Master. Under pines, I asked the boy. He says, "My master's gone to gather herbs." I only know he's in those mountains, in those deep clouds, but I don't know where. An hour or so later, the monk arrived, tired from his work, but clearly exuberant about having guests. He and Bill talked about his practice there in the mountains, and he told Bill how Pure Land Buddhism was different from the form practiced by many others in China. Pure Land Buddhism, he said, proclaimed that chanting the name of Buddha was sufficient in itself to guarantee rebirth in the Pure Land.
我不适应了。佛在这佛那个释迦牟尼佛在世的时候，那个时候那个根基，他那个时候那个人的根基深厚的。
He then served us some food, walnuts and persimmons this time. Since it was nearly 2, in early November, it was getting dark, and he'd invited us to spend the night. But we decided to head out since we wanted to get to Guanyin before dark.
哦，必须停了上。
我现在去观音山怎么走？
你从位置坪打车，从位置坪的问一下子，位置坪往里面走，里面还有小庙子。
He waved goodbye to us, and we turned to one another and asked why we were so intent on leaving such a place. Neither of us had an answer. A strenuous 3-hour climb took us to the top of Guanyin Shan, the home of Yan Zhao, the nun whose photo Bill had put on the cover of his book. We'd heard that she'd died the previous April, but we found her hut just as it had been, and one of her disciples had taken over responsibility for the area and now served as the abbot. When Bill showed the abbot his book, with Yan Zhao's photo on it, he immediately honored us as very important visitors, and he showed us to his hut, where he invited us for a warm meal and a good night's sleep. We slept on the abbot's kong, a kind of bed which is built of concrete above a type of stove to keep it heated.
他们很会煮菜。
The next morning, he showed us around the grounds. Workers were hauling stones and constructing a temple, which the abbot explained was in honor of Yan Zhao. Before she died, Yan Zhao had told the abbot that she would return to the mountain as a nun in 16 years. He plans to have the temple completed for her when she arrives, and he plans to build small huts near the temple where the hermit monks and nuns might live.
The Yan Zhao pagoda will be right here, and then the gullies will be all around here. And then they'll build a couple huts up each gully.
The abbot wanted us to meet one of his young disciples who had been living in the cave for the past 6 months. He'd remained there for another 2.5 years, not speaking to anyone, and spending his days in meditation.
There are many monasteries, especially those that are located in the countryside or in the foothills of mountains. There are areas nearby that are set aside for a practice called biguan, or enclosure, whereby one lives inside of a cave or a secluded hut, with one's needs in terms of food being supplied by those living in the main monastery. And this goes on for usually periods of 3 years, whereby you live inside the hut or the cave, and you're not allowed to speak to anybody, and you concentrate on your practice. There's usually a ceremony involving the whole monastery that takes place at the beginning of this period, and of course at the end of it. And it's a major achievement in the career of any monk or nun to undergo this sort of very strenuous and strict regimen.
Ready to 3年。
above this young monk's cave, we see a sign saying it's forbidden to speak. Doesn't mean that we can't speak, but it means that he is not allowed to speak. It's just a sign to remind us that he's not allowed to speak. The abbot there is telling this young monk that I myself, with this foreign visitor, has also received the Bodhisattva precepts in Taiwan, and he's come here to meet other Buddhist practitioners.
The abbot later emphasized the need for a Buddhist to live alone for a long period of time in order to recognize the uselessness of material things, in order to understand how transient all life really is.
He wants you to join.
I was asking him, I said, do you have to practice like this to become a Buddha? And he said, yes. He says, because as human beings, we're so used to comfort that the only way to get rid of this attachment to comfort is to go through a process of elimination, of forgetting comfort. And I asked him how long it takes. He says at least 3 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. Anyway, that's the process. If you don't do it, he says you're not going to reach the final goal of liberation because you're going to be attached to all the desires.
他最后入了孔定的时机，最后他的寿命到了，那无常生来拉他，无常鬼啊，无常鬼的话，两个拉铁锁链子来拴他。
Later in the morning, we left the temple area and headed back down the mountain. But along the trail, we met another hermit, a nun, and she also invited us to visit her hut. We were glad we accepted her invitation, since she lived in a spectacular place on top of a ridge with mountains as far as we could see on both sides. After a short conversation and some tea, we headed down to the river. Although this was a fairly easy hike, we went slowly, struck by the beauty of the place.
Well, that's Wanhua Shan, 10,000 flower mountain. And those little peaks are the flowers.
We got to the mouth of the gorge about an hour before our ride was scheduled to show up, so we climbed a short distance to another temple.
This temple, which is located just above the entrance to the gorge, is called Fengde Temple. It was founded in the Tang Dynasty by a very famous monk whose name was Mi Zong, a very famous philosopher monk.
We noticed a nun shaving another nun's head. This wasn't an uncommon sight, really, but it was a clear reminder of the Buddhist denial of material things. Our ride then took us to the noisy heart of Shian, and we thought back about the people we had met and the places we had been. The busy city reminded us of some of the reasons these Buddhists chose to live as they did. A day later, we were back in a taxi, this time to go to Nutai, another of the Jungnan Mountains. We were joined for this part of our trip by two of Bill's friends, Mary and Eileen, Americans who were working in China and who lived in Guangzhou. We first stopped by a temple Bill knew well, called Caodong Temple, where Bill again had an animated conversation with the abbot, a monk named Honglin. Caodong Temple is particularly well known for maintaining the stupa for Kumarajiva. His shrine is a simple brick pavilion with nothing inside except 3 meters of beautifully carved marble. Kumarajiva was a highly revered translator who died in the year 413 AD. Even now, some 1600 years later, his translations of the most significant Buddhist texts still remain unsurpassed in both style and phrasing. Records even show that when he was cremated, his tongue didn't burn. Naturally, Bill, a translator, had to pause and pay homage to Kumarajiva. On the way to Namutai, we stopped by a temple run by a man Bill called the Laughing Monk, one of the most engaging individuals any of us had ever met. He took us to the shrine for which his temple is best known, a shrine for the 500 arhats.
It's very common in many Buddhist temples to have a special hall set aside for the veneration of a group of 500 sages. Of course, the number is symbolic because when the Buddha was alive, he was often accompanied by a group of 500 disciples. And so the Chinese have just chosen 500 as a figure representing this group of the Buddha's age, but they have changed their representation. So there's Marco Polo, for example, appears sometimes in this group. They're different figures, and thus the hermit poets, even of China, are suddenly now in the group of 500. These are the statues of Coal Mountain and Pickup, or Han Shan and Shi De, two famous hermit poets of the Tang Dynasty. You have to understand that these special halls that were constructed for the 500 arhats were basically designed as a tourist attraction. When pilgrims came to visit the temple, this was an added inducement to get them to come to their temple to offer incense to the gods and so forth. And thus, it was another sight to see. And so it played an important role in raising the fame of a monastery, to say, oh, that monastery has a temple for the 500 arhats.
Although he was needed for a special ceremony that day, the master made us feel at home and comfortable, as though nothing mattered to him except for us. We left the Laughing Monk and his arhats, and our taxi took us deeper into the mountains. When the road ended, we climbed to another temple, and again the monks went to work preparing lunches for us, tasty bowls of noodles. The abbot wasn't at the temple, but a young monk was, and as always happened, he made us feel welcome, showing us around the temple and talking about Buddhism with Bill.
我等一下还要到大茅棚。大茅棚啊，那个大台去不去？对，在大茅棚不是的去大台，我们到大茅棚，然后要去小茅棚。我听说慧远法师已经。
A steep climb took us to the ridge, but just over the top, we spotted Mitu Temple, located at one of the most stunning spots we could imagine.
Shitters obviously not over here, right? We're walking over.
The abbot of this temple had a business degree from Beijing University, and he was determined to make this a major Buddhist center. Although Bill had been here before, he hadn't met this abbot. The man shared temple responsibilities with another monk, whom Bill had met, and who was away for a few days. This abbot seemed different from other monks we had met, somehow more affected and formal. Bill suggested that he'd even had some theatrical training.
现在有几个人？哦，大约6兄弟姐妹不是，是别那个出家人他们成就的，也都是在这个。
He took us to their meditation and study room, where he showed us the valuable Buddhist Tripitaka that had been donated to the temple by a nun from Taiwan.
The Tripitaka includes all Buddhist works attributed to the Buddha, as well as his major disciples of his lifetime and within the few centuries afterwards, some of the major early Indian philosophers. It also includes a lot of works added by the Chinese monks, mainly commentaries to the earlier Indian works. And the current edition was standardized in the Ming Dynasty about 400 or 500 years ago, and since then has remained pretty much unchanged.
In return for this gift, the temple carpenters had built a hut for the nun. We visited the hut and found the quality of the construction to be much higher than what we'd come to expect from the term hut.
除了搞一个帐，现在只能搞山上，到山上看看。如果将来以后下一次你来，我们已经就会把上头那个地方已经搞好。
The abbot then took us to the top of the mountain behind the temple, where workmen were constructing a large shrine. The abbot explained that he'd had to take the government to court to prevent their building a hotel and restaurant on this location. The idea of taking the Chinese government to court was hard for us to accept, but the abbot seemed to be someone who could do it.
3个分如果公元前、公元后，零在中间呢，说正极、负极也零在中间，所以站在圆周上才是。你看。
He also took us down the mountain from the temple to meet another monk, this one living alone and just about to begin a 3-year period of isolation, silence, and meditation.
花园洞地那个还远，还有半华里多路，那个洞子现在还不能取。那是我到最后的时候，累金封了过后，准备要到那个地方去修累金的。
He was apparently trying to get all his talking over with in the next few days, because he hardly stopped chattering all the time we were there.
远传高明，到处都知道箱子洞，就是个名呢，就从那们传来了，就叫箱子洞，是这样的叫。
The next morning we woke up to a sunny day with a disciple cleaning the ground and a monk doing his morning prayers. The 4 of us headed down the mountain into the valley in search of other hermits, a trip Bill had taken before. After about half an hour, we came upon a hut which had been built since Bill had last been there. Bill introduced himself to the hermit and talked a few minutes with this young monk. Soon we reached the hut of a nun whom Bill had interviewed in his book. Unfortunately, as with Yen Zhao, she had died since Bill's last trip, but her disciple was still living in the hut, and she remembered Bill well.
The nun's name was Hui Yuan. She'd been living there for 35 years with her disciple Cheng Bo, who joined her in the last 4 or 5 years. And since her passing, Cheng Bo has taken over and now has her disciples, continuing the hermit tradition.
We continued our trek into the valley, finally arriving at a farmer's house. Bill went in to inquire about any monks who may be living nearby, only to find that one was visiting the farmer at that very moment. The monk smiled and greeted us, and invited us to his hut across the valley and a quarter mile up the other side. He turned out to be exactly my age, and he and Bill laughed about that.
You're looking pretty good now.
We followed him, and when we got to his hut, he took us into his room and talked to us about the seriousness of his practice and about the need for isolation from the world. He then prepared some hot water and brown sugar for us, and we sat in the sunshine enjoying the setting, the company, and the drink.
哦，是北坡。北坡，它这个太阳呢往南去了，冬天；夏天呢，它这个一天到晚都是太阳。
By now it was afternoon, and we had a hard climb back up the mountainside ahead of us, so we excused ourselves and headed out. Halfway up the trail, we heard a man singing, and soon the monk, whom we had seen doing his early morning prayers, came down the mountain filled with joy and music.
阿弥陀佛，阿弥陀佛，下面这个阿弥陀佛，毛回去了。哦，是，咱们这山高路远就是冷气。哎。
Back at the temple, we had a late lunch and another conversation with the abbot. The nun from Taiwan who had donated the Tripetica was also there now. She had studied philosophy at Taiwan National University and had only recently taken her vows to be a nun. She came to China in search of a master. We hated to leave Mitu Temple. Even the toilet had a view. That was something we certainly wouldn't find in Shian.
谢谢。拜拜。
后会有期了。好。
Again, we were reminded of the reasons for living the hermit's life as we re-entered the smoke and noise of the city. The following morning, we left early for another mountain, Jiawutai. On the way, we stopped at a temple called Xingqiao Temple, known for its 2 pagodas, the larger of which held the Buddhist master Xuanzang's relics. This is the same monk who had been responsible for the creation of Shian's Big Goose Pagoda. Actually, when Xuanzang died in 664, his remains and relics were placed in this pagoda, but the pagoda was near the capital. The constant sight of this structure so saddened the emperor, who had loved Xuanzang, that he had the entire pagoda moved here 5 years after the monk died. This was appropriate, since Xuanzang had described these peaks as the grandfather of all mountains. This pagoda dwarfed the 2 temples next to it, the ones containing the relics of Xuanzang's most famous disciples. These 3 monks together are considered to be the founders of what became known as the mind-only school of Chinese Buddhism, the school which teaches that this world is nothing but mind. We found a peaceful spot overlooking a valley and surrounded by farmers' fields. Out front, a man was selling calligraphy of works by some of the most famous of the Chinese poets.
I love this poem.
Oh, this particular poem is a poem of Jia Dao, Tang Hermit. He was a monk for a while and then defrocked and just wrote poetry for the rest of his life. This poem is one of his most famous poems.
Then we began our trip to Jiawutai. It started with a 3-kilometer hike up to the base of the mountain. We had to hike because a cart had broken down in the road and our taxi couldn't get past. As so often happens, though, we were fortunate for this problem, since the hike enabled us to slow down and pay attention to some of the children, to some men building a mud wall the old-fashioned way. Only then did we get to the base of the mountain. On the far side of the mountain, in a secluded spot known as Lion Cliff, sits the hut we came to visit. It was formerly owned by one of China's great Zen hermit teachers, Shian, better known to the West as Empty Cloud. He is certainly, Bill explained, the most revered monk of the 20th century. Although no one was present at Empty Cloud's site, Bill was pleased to find that someone had been living there. Also, since Bill's previous trip 3 years earlier, someone had built a shrine to Empty Cloud. We helped ourselves to some water, stood quietly a while in that magical place, and talked of Empty Cloud.
Empty Cloud was easily the most famous monk of the last 100 years in China. He founded the Buddhist Association of China, lived to be 120 years old, was responsible for a renaissance in Zen in China, renovated, reconstructed a half a dozen major monasteries, was beaten up and left for dead on 2 occasions by the Chinese communists, somehow managed to survive until the age of 120.
The next morning, we made one more trip to the Shian city wall to get a sense of its massiveness. And while we were in the city, we noticed this monk walking about, seemingly unaffected by his surroundings. We wondered about him, about where he might have trained, about how he learned his skills of quietude among the chaos. This monk represented the very freedoms we'd been focusing on. And then we visited the Buddhist temple in the city. While there, we met the abbot, and he took us to meet the meditation hall master. The old master had actually studied with Empty Cloud, and we were surprised that he invited us into the meditation hall.
Bring that camera in. It's quite a rare honor to be allowed to bring a camera, especially a video camera, into a meditation hall. A temple that takes meditation seriously, and some do, many don't. But in those temples that do practice meditation, meditation can last several hours a day, or it could last over a dozen hours a day. In this particular temple, it's about a dozen hours a day. And that goes on for about 70 days. And then you have a break, and then there's another 70-day session. At this temple, there are 4 70-day sessions throughout the year. So a total of 280 days of continual meditation where you get about 4 hours sleep. The rest of the day is meditating, walking during the periods of meditation, and then, of course, bathing occasionally and eating a meal. Very intensive meditation techniques they were using at that temple, and they use at many meditation temples, is to chant the name of the Buddha, and then to ask yourself, who is chanting the name of the Buddha? So that old monk's name is Yan-en, Master Yan-en. He's the master of the meditation hall, and he's 78, 78岁, and he's a disciple of Empty Cloud. 他延南法师有没有找到云居山？
他就是云居山高明寺，他是九祖高明寺。
哦，也是高明寺，高明寺
来了的小
扬州的，
哎，高明寺，
还有云居山，
他是高明寺的首座。
哦，如成法师呢，在哪里？
我就叫个如成，这就是如成吧？
对，如成法师在哪里？是学禅。
我就是在庙上的主管人。
The abbot told me that the meditation master was from Gaoming Temple in Yangzhou, one of several places that Empty Cloud had helped reconstruct.
Bill and I then began what he termed the Daoist portion of our journey and left for the Daoist temple in Shian.
This is Xian, the Temple of the Eight Immortals, a Daoist group of the Tang Dynasty. 美国人，我是作家，我朋友。I told him what we were doing and asked him if we could take pictures, videotape the Eight Immortals, after which the temple is named, and he said, no, that wouldn't be permitted. So it's sort of funny that we could videotape a living sages meditating, but not the stone ones.
The Taoist priests seemed to greet us more with curiosity and suspicion than with the natural warmth we received from the Buddhists. Rather than talk about their religion and their practice, they appeared more interested in finding out who we were and what we were doing. We left for Loguantai that afternoon. Loguantai, meaning observation tower, was constructed in the 10th century BC by Zhou dynasty Emperor Mu. This is where Lao Tzu taught after his time in the wilderness, and it's the site of an early stele of the Tao Te Ching, one of the sacred texts of Taoism.
Here we are at the entrance to Loguantai, where Lao Tzu delivered the Tao Te Ching. Just at the entrance, a stupa of a Buddhist monk from the Kunlun Mountains, of these Kun Shan. And he was a precept master, so he probably studied at Jingye Temple where we've been. His name was Yi Bo, and robe and bowl top. I see. No, his robe and bowl are here. And his name was Kun Shan. Yes.
We then made our way to the main temple and were accosted by several enthusiastic young guides who were being trained for the upcoming tourist season. They showed us around the temple, one of them speaking English fairly well, a rare find in the mountains.
Can we take a picture of the? 这里有一个元朝的道德经，可不可以照相
？OK。
在那个碑文。
一般不准照，今天你进去，还得在后面，这
今天没人。
可以的，
很意外。
这次，在这，就在这。
Go take a picture of the entrance here, and this is the.
这原来沿袭在这儿。
We're not supposed to take pictures in here, but there's not really anybody else here today, so they'll let us take just a few photos. Just be careful.
中间桥两边都可以。
不太像，这是
旁边这八个尖。
It is made of stone. Why did he can ring?
Why can it ring? I don't know. It must be a very special kind of stone.
Ah, yes.
But we don't know its structure.
No, I don't either.
The shrine they took us to is where Lao Tzu was supposed to have taught his disciple Yinxi the lessons that made up the Tao Te Ching. Just inside the gates of the main shrine were the two steles carved in the 13th century with the Tao and the De sections of the text. Behind these, we found two other shrines, one honoring the Lady of the Southern Dipper, who looks after human destinies, and the other honoring the Princess of Rainbow-Colored Clouds, bestower of children.
Watch your step now, going down.
Yeah. Boy, I almost lost.
It's also home to a ginkgo tree said to have been planted by Lao Tzu himself. We left to climb the mountainside behind the temple in search of an old Daoist nun named Chang, whom Bill had met and interviewed on his previous trip. On the way to her hut, we came across Lien Tian Lu, or Cinnabar Cauldron, a newly remodeled shrine with one of the nicest statues of Lao Tzu that we'd ever seen. This was where Bill had met Zhang a few years earlier, and it was established to commemorate the place Lao Tzu was said to have smelted his elixir before departing for the land of immortals. Unfortunately, once we got to Zhang's hut, we learned that she had become sick and had moved down the mountain. A monk was now occupying her place, and he gladly took us in for tea and conversation.
谢谢。倒是可以给我们念这个。I'm gonna ask him to read it.
这个是因为我死的嘛，这不念。
He showed us a book he used to tell people's fortunes. Daoism, more than Buddhism, relies on magic and fortune-telling to examine the future.
那我们今天来是吉祥不吉祥？啊？我们今天来是吉祥不吉祥？有吉祥。哦，吉祥。哦，有样。 Oh, Yang. Oh, Yang. Oh, 他姓Yang. Oh, Yang 的是。再见。
By the time we got back to the temple, the young guides spotted us again, and this time took us to meet their supervisor, a government official whom Bill had also met before. In fact, the man said that Bill's previous conversation with him had convinced him to become a Daoist himself. Bill didn't really believe him, and figured he was actually prying for information about us to report to the police. Leaving the temple, we bought some peanuts from a street vendor Bill had remembered. Then we went to the quarters of the leader of the regional Daoist community, Master Ren Farung, whom Bill had met twice before, and who was considered to be one of the leading Daoist masters in all China. Bill was concerned about meeting him, because Bill had the impression that Master Ren didn't like him much. This time, however, maybe because Bill showed him his picture in Road to Heaven, Master Ren welcomed us warmly. Bill was still a bit suspicious, though, particularly when he found one of the young priests from the Daoist temple in Shian sitting and talking with Master Ren when we arrived. Master Ren arranged for us to visit Lao Tzu's grave, a rare experience since the gravesite had always been off limits to foreigners. The next morning, a young priest came to our hotel in the police car and picked us up. We drove about 5 kilometers to the site of the grave mound. I was surprised by the modesty of what I saw, especially considering that this is the burial site of one of the world's greatest religious leaders. Bill said this is partly because the claim that this is his grave isn't well substantiated, and it's partly because the Red Guard broke up a previous shrine and used the stone to help build the nearby power station.
This is a stele carved in the Qianlong period of the Qing dynasty, and with Lao Tzu's name, Zhou Lao. Zhou being the Zhou dynasty, and Lao being Lao Tzu's name.
这就周之前啊，以前那个为了纪念，这还有一个老子墓。
One of Lao Tzu's biographers wrote in the 1st century BC that Lao Tzu had disappeared through Sangguan Pass, a 2-day ride from Loguantai. Therefore, he couldn't be buried at this spot. Bill said one monk explained that both theories could be true, since Daoists shed their bones like a snake sheds its skin, and Lao Tzu could easily have left his mortal coil at Loguantai before slipping away. Our guide insisted that this monument would be improved soon. As it is now, you can easily kill yourself getting across the river to the mound, and when you finally do get there, you need a Daoist guide to show you where it is. The plaque commemorating this sacred site stands out about as clearly as another tree on the mountainside. We left Loguantai and hiked to the highway, stopping along the way to admire a well-crafted statue of Lao Tzu, this time sitting aboard his ox in commemoration of his journey to Loguantai. Arriving at the highway, we found a small noodle restaurant open, and we watched in admiration as the cooks made noodles for us. We then boarded a bus to take us to the sacred mountain of Huashan, some 100-odd kilometers the other side of Shian. Taoism may have originated in its historic form on Loguantai, but in its prehistoric form, it flourished on Huashan. The morning after we arrived in Huashan City, snow was falling. Cold and wet, we hiked past the tourist shops and entered the gate for the Jade Spring Temple at the foot of the mountain. Bill had a problem with the ticket taker, who insisted upon making us pay foreign tourist prices, even though we had our false papers with us, claiming we were teaching in the country. With the help of a Daoist priest, wearing one of the coolest hats I'd ever seen, we managed to get in. It's a beautiful temple, one Bill had visited several times.
This tree was brought here about 1000, at least the sapling was brought here about the year 1000, planted by Chen Tuan, the Daoist hermit who lived here. It was a sapling from the tree under which the Buddha was born, the Ashoka tree, in Chinese, the Wu You Shu, no trouble tree. And that pavilion on top of the boulder was originally also built by Chen Tuan around the year 1000.
Bill then took me to meet Master Shian, an old Daoist priest whom Bill remembered.
怎么样？现在腿还是厉害，还是厉害，还是发炎啊！不要照相，不要上头3点一横2点。
Master Shian, when he was younger, was very famous throughout China for his ability in martial arts. But after prolonged meditation, his knees have become arthritic and he's lost his skill.
In his last visit, Bill had been told by Master Shian that the government was now allowing religion to be practiced, but mainly for the promotion of tourism. In fact, he said, things are getting worse for Daoists, not better. The master was in poor health, so after a short conversation with him, we left and returned to the temple. Bill asked a young priest about another old Daoist, Master Shu. Master Shu, it turns out, was also living there in the temple, so the young priest took us to meet him.
He
was in relatively good shape, and he and Bill spoke for quite a while. His disciple brought us tea and fruit while they spoke.
Well, he lived for about 50 years up on top of the peak of Huashan. In fact, my first trip, he was still living up at the peak. And then 2 years later, when I got there, he had moved down. And he was just a famous Taoist master. And he devoted all the money he ever made to the renovation of the Taoist temples in the area.
We left Master Shu and headed for the sacred mountain. We'd hoped to be able to climb it. Because of the snow, this was impossible. Bill's description of the mountain from his book had really impressed me, and I was very disappointed that we wouldn't be able to do it. On the other hand, the extreme danger he had described would have been even greater in the winter, so perhaps we were fortunate not to be tempted. Still, Bill was anxious to show me the caves in the side of the mountain, where hermits had lived off and on for centuries. After a slow 3-kilometer hike through the snow, we located some of the caves. Since they appeared to be occupied, Bill decided to visit. The climb up the sheer wall to the caves was extremely dangerous. No one was home, but Bill sat a while in one cave just to get the feel of it. We left Huashan the next morning, headed for Lingbai, a 4-hour train ride from Huashan. Lingbai is near where Lao Tzu left civilization on his water buffalo. That spot is now commemorated with a statue of Lao Tzu and a massive tourist-type shrine. It seemed that perhaps Master Xie was right about the government trying to turn the Daoists into a big tourist attraction. We waited around Lingbai train station, hoping to catch a train to Luoyang, another of ancient China's historical centers. In Luoyang, we visited the Longmen Caves. The caves held hundreds of statues of Buddhas of all sizes, positions, and conditions. The Red Guard and other marauders had done damage to these sculptures throughout the years, but several hundred still stood.
This Wei Dynasty, Northern Wei Dynasty Buddha was carved in the year 523.
Note the smile on its face. This is the early days of Buddhism when it was seen as a blissful religion. Doctrine of suffering hadn't been emphasized.
We then visited one of China's most famous Buddhist temples, known as the White Horse Temple.
When Buddhism first arrived from India, this was the first temple established for the reception of the early foreign monks in the 1st century AD. Because the monks arrived on a white horse, it was called White Horse Temple.
The next morning we began our journey to the cave where Bodhidharma had lived for 9 years after arriving in China from India. The shrine was closed for the season, but we hiked up the mountainside to the cave itself. The cave is decorated with some small statues, but otherwise it must be very much as it was some 1,300 years ago, when Bodhidharma occupied it.
Now, Bodhidharma was the first patriarch of Zen in China. That is, he's the man who brought Zen from India to China. And he found few disciples, and so he just lived inside this cave and meditated for 9 years. Every day he faced the wall of the cave and meditated. And finally, one Chinese monk came and asked him for instruction, and his monk's name was Hui Ke. And he was so sincere and devout in wanting to understand Zen that he cut off his arm while he was standing and stood in the snow for several days outside Bodhidharma's cave before Bodhidharma finally agreed to come out and instruct him. And that's how Zen began in China.
Below the cave is a village built around a temple.
This is the famous Shaolin Temple, famous for its Kung Fu, martial arts practice. And monks still come here from all over China to practice martial arts, but among Buddhists, martial arts has never been highly esteemed, and most monks look down on those who do practice it. These are the temple guardians, to wrathful deities to protect the temple precincts from evil influences. That's the statue of Hui Ke. Used to be over here with Bodhidharma.
I particularly liked the carnival-type Buddha figure, some sort of funhouse, we guessed, which dominated the village. An overnight train ride to the south got us into Wuhan around noon the next day. We hopped into a cab and drove to the museum to look at some pieces Bill wanted me to see.
Well, the hermit tradition, practiced by both the Daoists and the Buddhists still today, harkens back to the early years of Chinese civilization when the religion was shamanistic and required communication with the spiritual realm. And this communication was required the solitude of mountains, and often a little help from drugs, herbs, alcohol too for that communication. And the visions that these early shamans encountered on this spiritual quest of theirs are often portrayed in the ritual and artistic objects unearthed in tombs.
We're
back on another bus by 2 that afternoon, headed for Shian. This bus trip stands out because of the fight between one of the passengers, a tough farm lady, and the woman who took the tickets. Apparently, the farmer thought she was being overcharged, so the two of them argued, shouted, and screamed about it. The shouting eventually turned into slugging and gouging and choking, and since this took place in the seat directly behind us, I couldn't help turning on my camera to capture as much of it as I could. It was another good reminder why the monks chose to live in the mountains by themselves. Our purpose in stopping in Shian was to see the remains of the old Zhou dynasty capital and to visit the museum.
This was the capital of the ancient state of Chu. Now, Chu was the most powerful state in ancient China around Confucius's time. And Chu was also the most shamanistic of all the states of China, the most prone to the early forms of Daoism than the other states. Court rituals and dancers, and spirits coming down from heaven. A famous sword used in a battle around 500 BC. This is a beacon tower, the remains of a fire beacon tower from the ancient state capital, from the ancient capital of the state of Chu, used to relay warnings of impending invaders.
因为这是出国以前的度，国度。Mill Bay, over here on the next hill. Mill Bay being the pretender for to reestablish the Han Dynasty.
We also got a chance to see the walls of the city, and we stayed in Shian for a couple of nights. Near Shian, we climbed aboard one of the many ferry boats on the Yangtze and headed west toward the famous Yangtze Gorges. After about 3 hours, we found ourselves in the first of the gorges. We were curious to see this country, so much of which would be underwater once the new dam was completed. Another hour or so, and we were landing in Wanqi.
And see what we can get in the way of, we have to walk up there, see if we can buy some tickets and look for some transport into town.
We took a bus up a side gorge, and Bill got into an argument with the driver about the fare. We then hiked along another river valley until we arrived at the small farming village of Lepingli, Julian's birthplace.
Shian was an advisor to the king of Chu, whose capital we had just visited. And he had warned the king of Chu that the king of Qin was not to be trusted. And the king of Chu did not believe Shian, and eventually he was slandered, and Shian was banished to the south of China, or south of the Yangtze at least. Eventually, the king of Chu was in fact captured by the king of Qin and held prisoner for the rest of his life, never regained his freedom again, and the state of Chu was wiped out, eliminated. And the day that happened, Shian, living in exile south of the Yangtze, committed suicide, jumped into the river, and to this day his death is commemorated with the dragon boat races throughout China. And he's viewed as one of the true early patriots of China. And he was also the first great poet of China. There are other people who wrote the occasional poem, but Shian wrote exquisite verse that's still chanted and studied and talked about today. He lived around 300 BC.
We both loved this quiet setting, and Bill remembered it well. We climbed the hill to the special shrine built for Chu Yin and met with Mr. Xu, the caretaker of the shrine. He fixed us some tea, and Bill talked him into reciting some of the poetry that he had written in the style of Chu Yin.
These are all poems by local farmers. These are all farmers who wrote these poems. And he's hoping to get money from... These are all old farmers. Like most of them are about 60 or 70 years old.
华能东王是相期，一系昭君其丹羽，汗马之功之分德，琵琶犹抱恨毛图。毛图跟昭君把这画一颗胸痣，所以汉王就不接见他了。毛图啊，这是毛图的怪。本来昭君是个很美的女子的，她应该跟汉王做妃子。对。那个毛图呢，就跟画师啊，会画像，过去是画像没这个照相机啊。
I don't have a clue as to what he's saying. I don't have a clue. This gentleman who's was the head of the local poet society had been collecting the poems of his fellow farmers and had compiled this edition, and it was his hope that he could find a publisher for this. He said that he had several hundred poems, and they were all fine poems. In fact, one thing that I noticed in them is that a lot of their rhythmic patterns reflected the usages of Shian 2,300 years ago, and they were still basically using his same rhythmic structures.
Another of the group also agreed to recite a poem he had written.
来念一首诗，好不好？请。
就是你做的嘛，就是你做的。
对。
你做的最经典。
宜江南啊，这个字形或者都是一样的。忠直守，斗志是刚坚，大敌当前无畏惧，人民众富口心血。
I think of these men often. They're not hermits, of course, but they live quietly, away from the cities, and they respond deep in their hearts to the poems and the life of Chu Yin.
大南圈，咱们有个时代，有个还存在幸免，还有说上的，正气即山川。身为大，死中泰山间，莫招祸。
The next morning, early, Mr. Xu took Bill and me up into the mountains nearby to show us some places Chu Yin used to go, including the location of his home and the place where he sat to meditate.
你看，清水尝一尝。
This well not only tastes refreshing, but it was also used by Shian to clear his eyes when he was growing tired when he was studying or reading. So the well's water is noted for its ability to refresh one's eyes and one's mind as well as one's thirst.
哦，我有，自己有，我早上吃了。
我们是真的是控制吧？是啊，你那个人头太多了，我们人头还是
这是肉桂，
多种。
We agreed that this was a magical place to be, and somewhat sadly we headed back down the valley to the muddy Yangtze.
One of Shian's most famous poems was about meeting a fisherman when he was just trying to decide whether or not to commit suicide. The fisherman asked him, what fate has brought you to this? And Shian answered, the world is muddy. I alone am clean. Everyone is drunk. I alone am sober. And so they sent me away. And the fisherman said, the sage isn't bothered by others. He can change with the times. If the world is muddy, splash in the mire. If everyone is drunk, drink up the dregs. Why get banished for deep thought and purpose? At the end of the poem, the fisherman smiled and rowed away singing, the waters are clear, I wash my hat. When the waters are muddy, I wash my feet. Which means that you wash your hat when you're going to go off to get a civil service job and dedicate your life to helping the country in a government capacity. Whereas if you wash your feet, you're going to stay home and just farm.
This time we stayed on the boat for over 24 hours, sleeping in a room near the bow that we had to ourselves.
Yeah.
In the morning, in spite of the cold, we sat comfortably on deck, drinking whiskey and watching the shore go by. We finally arrived at our destination, Yeyang, that afternoon. Still in search of the life of Shian, the next morning we hired a taxi and drove toward another shrine to the revered poet, this one not far from Milo. We came to a river along the way.
This is the river in which Shian committed suicide, the Milo River.
Walking around this shrine, we were both struck by how much the people seemed to love Shian. We then weaved our way through farmers' fields until we arrived at Shian's burial mound. As I had thought with Lao Tzu's burial place, this seemed very modest for such a significant figure. This trip into China with Red Pine really changed my life. It showed me the power in living simply, in focusing rather than scattering, in cutting back and saying no. The monks and nuns and the farmers and poets, they seem to know how to breathe, how to live with depth rather than breadth, how to accept life. This affected me. It reminded me of the futility of rushing, of always looking for a machine to do the work I could just as well do with my hands. A line from one of Bill's translations expressed this feeling perfectly for me. A Buddhist poet named Pickup was talking about the joy he felt sitting on a hillside, meditating. He wrote, "If the sea should become a mulberry grove, it wouldn't mean much to me." The absurdity, yet the significance of that line echoes in my mind. It reminds me of the trip I took with Red Pine, and it reminds me of the people that I met in the mountains of China.